Welcome back. All right, time to talk about the standings in the National Hockey League. We're a month into the season, a little more than a month if you count those overseas games from the 4th and the 5th. So I figured, all right, we're going to cover this today. And then every month on the 8th, we'll take a look at where the standings are and how teams have done over that month in between when I did the standings and then do them again. So Florida's leading the way in the Atlantic, and we'll cover the Atlantic, the Metro, the Central, and the Pacific in that order. I've done the divisional standings instead of doing wild card standings. At some point, probably in the second video, we'll do top three in each division, the wild card, and all that. But I think this is a good way to show which divisions are potentially the strongest and all of that. So Florida leading the Atlantic Division, 10-3-1 start so far, 21 points, 3.86 goals scored per game, 3.07 goals against. Scoring by period tells you that they don't have a bad one. 19-15 in the first in their favor, 21-18 in the second in their favor, and 13-9 in the third, again in their favor. They've scored once, allowed one in the overtime. They're 8-1-1 in their last 10. They've won 6 in a row, and they're kind of a machine right now. So after an iffy start to the season, yeah, they've really had quite the last 10 games. Then you got Toronto second with a record of 7-5-2 for 16 points, scoring 3.07 goals per game, allowing 2.79 goals against per game. And they do well early, they don't do great late. So they're scoring 12 in the first, allowing 11. Second period, they're quite good, outscoring the opposition 20-13. They've been outscored 13-11 in the third, and they've allowed both goals in overtime in the overtime games they've played. So their record over their last 10 is 4-4-2. They did win their last game. I think the fact Toronto's doing well, even though Matthews hasn't been the goal scoring machine, he's even been out of the lineup. He'll be out of the lineup tonight, injured, and probably tomorrow as well. But with the way Toronto's been playing, with the way Nylander's been playing, they should be okay. And so being second in the division when things aren't necessarily going great, that's a good sign because Toronto eventually will get things rolling. For Tampa Bay, they're 7-6-1, 15 points. They're scoring 3.5 goals per game. They're allowing 3.14 goals against per game. They're only 4-5-1 over their last 10. Their most recent game, of course, a shootout loss against Philadelphia. They're outscoring the opposition 14-10 in the first period, but they're outscored 18-16 in the second period. They've scored and allowed 18 in the third, and they've scored the only overtime goal scored in games they've been participant in so far. So, yeah, for Tampa Bay, there's been some good and some bad along the way. And I do think there's some troubling signs here that maybe Tampa Bay's time as a contending elite team could be done, but we'll see, at least for this year. Then there's Boston. Boston's above the playoff line, 7-7-1. In terms of points percentage, Detroit would be ahead of them right now, but you only go by points, and Boston has 15. They're scoring 2.53 goals per game. That needs to improve. They're allowing 3.27 goals against per game. That needs to improve as well. They're 4-5-1 in their last 10. They did win their last game last night against Calgary. They're scoring 13 and allowing 16 in the first period so far. They've scored 17 and allowed 16 in the second period. And then the third, the bottom falls out. They've been outscored 16-5 in the third period. In overtime, they get it together. They've outscored the opposition 3-1. But that third period is absolutely awful. That has to improve for Boston if they're going to stay above the playoff line. For Detroit, they're 6-5-1 thus far, 13 points, scoring 2.75 goals per game and allowing 3 goals against per game, even. They're 5-4-1 in their last 10. They've won 2 in a row. They've been outscored in the first period, 12-9. They've scored and allowed 12 goals in the second period. They've scored 12 and allowed 11 in the third period. And they allowed the only goal that's been scored in an overtime period so far this season. So they're 0-1 there. But yeah, Detroit, they're headed somewhat in the right direction to the point where, yeah, they should pass Boston if they can stay above 500. And if Boston doesn't get above 500. But Boston seems to be, over the last couple games, getting things figured out. So that could be a fun little fight to the end of the season, couldn't it? Buffalo's fighting to get themselves back into the fight. They're 6-7-1, 13 points for them, so only 2 points back of Boston with a game in hand. 3.36 goals scored per game, which is good. The 3.14 goals against per game needs to come down a little bit. They are 5-4-1 in their last 10, same as Detroit. They've also won their last 2. They've outscored the opposition in the first period 13-10. They've outscored the opposition 19-17 in the second. They've been outscored in the third 16-15. and they've allowed the only goal scored in an overtime that they featured in this year. So for Buffalo, it's a mixed bag so far. I wish I had brighter news for them, but at the very least, they're not out of the race. Then we get to Ottawa. Ottawa's troubling. They're 6-7, 12 points, 3.46 goals scored, 3.23 goals allowed per game. They're 4-6 in their last 10, and they've lost 2 in a row. And it does feel like things have started going against Ottawa. Again, it is November. This is what happens every year. Now, in terms of scoring, they've outscored the opposition 16-9 in the first period this year. They've been outscored 14-12 in the second and 19-16 in the third. And then in the overtime, they've scored the only goal in an overtime period that they've played so far. So for Ottawa, things are... There's a tipping point coming pretty quickly here. They are 3 points back of a playoff spot, which is nothing at this stage. But for the Buffalo Sabres, or for the Ottawa Senators, I should say, this is the year they're supposed to make the playoffs. I mean, really, Detroit, Buffalo, Ottawa. They're all in a line again. And which one's going to make the playoffs or none of them? And for years now, it's been none of them. So we'll see if that continues this year. Montreal, 4-8-2 on the season, 10 points, 2.71 goals scored per game. They've allowed 4.07 goals against per game. I do get a kick out of people, though, trying to blame Montembeault right now for the team struggles. It's not on Montembeault. They're 2-6-2 over their last 10. They did lose their last game. This is a team with a very young defense. Young defense equals usually porous defense. And so that's where I would, if you're going to have to assign blame, that's where I would look with Montreal. But it's baked into a rebuild, right? So they've been outscored 20-12 in the first period and 21-11 in the third period. So that needs to be cleaned up. In the second period, they've actually scored 15 and allowed 15. In the overtime, they have not scored yet in overtime. They've allowed 1 in overtime. They are 2-6-2 in their last 10. And again, they did lose last night against New Jersey. So their most recent game, a loss. And they are at the bottom of their division. And I would not be surprised to see them remain there for this season. There's some more pressure on Montreal than last year, but it still looks like a rebuilding team. The Metropolitan Division is led by the Carolina Hurricanes. They are 10-2. They're 9-1 in their last 10. They've won 8 in a row. So if they win their next 2 games, I have to do a video on it, and I just did a video on them. They have 20 points, 4.17 goals scored per game. They're allowing 2.33 goals against per game. Those numbers are ridiculous. And no matter which period they're in, they're very good. 15-7, they've outscored the opposition in the first period, 16-9 in the second period, and 17-12 in the third. They've also scored both goals scored in an overtime they featured in. Just insane numbers. So, yeah, Carolina, pretty comfortable, although New Jersey, 9-5-2. They also have 20 points. Of course, Carolina has games in hand on New Jersey. 3.63 goals scored per game for New Jersey, 2.81 goals against. New Jersey's the only team currently residing above the playoff line that did not make the playoffs last year. So not a lot of turnover right now if you look at the playoff situation in the East. New Jersey's 5-3-2 in their last 10. They've won 2 in a row. They've won 3 of their last 4. I think they're getting it together. In the first period, they've scored 13. They've allowed 13. Second period, they've outscored the opposition 24-15. Third period, they outscored the opposition 21-15 so far. They've allowed both goals in overtime, though. They have not scored in overtime as of yet. Washington's 9-3, so they're right there. They have 18 points, and of course, they have games in hand on New Jersey as well. 4.08 goals scored per game. Who saw that coming? Put your hand down. No, you didn't. 2.92 goals against per game. I apologize. That was harsh. They've been 8-2-0 in their last 10. They did win their last game. That kind of looks like 82-0 if you're on your phone, doesn't it? I'm going to leave it that way. But at any rate, they've outscored the opposition 19-8 in the first period, so they start on time. They've been outscored in the second period 19-18, but they've outscored the opposition 11-8 in the third, and they've scored the only overtime goal so far in an overtime period they've played. So Washington has got it all together right now. We'll see if that continues. The Rangers, things have started to slide a little bit. They're 8-3-1. They've got 17 points, 3.75 goals scored per game, 2.5 goals against per game. They're outscoring the opposition 16-9 in the first. They've scored and allowed 14 in the second. They've outscored the opposition 15-6 in the third. They've allowed the only overtime goal in an overtime game they've played this season. They're 7-3 in their last 10, and they're coming off of an embarrassing loss against Buffalo. But this is where it's interesting because the top 4 teams in the Metropolitan Division all of them ahead of the Toronto Maple Leafs in terms of points. So is the Metropolitan Division tougher than the Atlantic? Early returns would say yes. Let me know your thoughts. New York Islanders, the only team that finished above the playoff line this past season that's below it currently. No, they did make it. They were 6-6-2. I had to think about that for a second. 6-6-2. 14 points, scoring 2.43 goals per game, allowing 3 goals per game. They missed Duclair, but they also could use some more production from a lot of their forwards. They're 5-5 in their last 10. They've won 2 in a row, so they're back to NHL 500. They need to get above that. They've scored 11 and allowed 10 in the first period. They've scored 10 and allowed 11 in the second period. Third period, they've been outscored 19-12, and in overtime, they've been outscored 2-1. So finishing has been a problem for the New York Islanders in terms of the overall numbers, and middle of the pack in terms of first and second periods. Columbus 5-5-2, and they looked pretty good a week, 10 days ago maybe, but recent results not so much. So they've scored 3 1/3 goals per game. They've also allowed 3 1/3 goals per game. They're 4-4-2 in their last 10, and their last result was a loss in overtime against San Jose. They've scored 11 and allowed 10 in the first periods this year. They've scored 16 and allowed 15 in the second. They've scored and allowed 13 goals in the third period, and they've allowed both overtime goals in games that they've played. So for Columbus, a team that it looked like maybe they're ready to get back above the playoff line and stay there again about a week to 10 days ago, it has changed since then. Tough schedule, but still, everybody has a tough schedule at certain points, and it's about navigating that well and staying above the line. Pittsburgh, 5-8-2 record for them overall for 12 points. 2.8 goals scored for them, 3.8 goals against. So that's a problem, and they're 2-6-2 in their last 10. They did lose their game last night against Carolina. They have not had a period that they have outscored an opposition other than overtime. So they've been outscored 15-10 in the first, 22-13 in the second, and 20-17 in the third. They have scored both overtime goals, though, in games that went to overtime that they've played. So for Pittsburgh, they need to find a period where they're pretty good at playing, although they're near the break-even point in the third with only allowing 3 more goals than they score. Philadelphia, 5-8-1, 11 points for them, so they're 1 point ahead of last place Montreal in the East. They're scoring 2.5 goals per game. They're allowing 3.64 goals against per game. This is a team that does not score well, so they need good goaltending. Last night, they got that from Fedotov, too. So Philadelphia is 4-6 on the season. They won last night over Tampa in a shootout. But they haven't outscored the opposition well in one particular period. So they've been outscored 12-10 in the first period, 22-8 the second period. So the long change, not good for Philly. They've outscored the opposition 17-16 in the third period, and they've allowed the only overtime goal in a game that they've played. And remember, that's overtime goal. It doesn't count shootouts. So, yeah. Let me just go ahead and take a bit of a timestamp here for people who want to just see the West or just see the East. So now we're going to talk about the Central and Western leading and NHL leading Winnipeg Jets. I keep seeing Jets fans going, when do we get a video? You guys have had the power rankings for 3 weeks. You're number 1 on the list. I'm wearing a Jets jersey again. There's all kinds of positive news around the Jets. As far as I'm concerned right now, almost every video kind of is a Jets video. So they're 13-1 for 26 points. They're scoring 4.5 goals per game, and they're allowing 2.14 goals against per game. They're 9-1 in their last 10, and they've won 5 in a row. They outscore the opposition in every period. Whatever you want to throw at them, they win. 16-10 in the first, 19-12 in the second, 25-8 in the third period, and they've scored all 3 goals in overtimes. So that's insane, because overtime is kind of a coin flip, and for Winnipeg, it isn't. Heads, both coins, double-sided, and they just call heads and they win. Until people figure out that coin, they're good. Minnesota. So one difference between the East and the West is in the West, there are some teams that are above the playoff line that were not last year. In the East, there's just the one, but Minnesota's 9-2-2. So 20 points for them, 3.62 goals scored per game, 2.62 goals against per game. They're 8-2 in their last 10. They have won their last game. They've outscored the opposition in almost every period, minus overtime. 12-7 in the first, 16-10 in the second, 18-16 in the third. They've scored and allowed a goal in overtime so far this season. So yeah, Minnesota, whatever you throw at them, they're ready. Then there's Dallas, 8-4. Of course, they lost both games over in Finland. They have 16 points, 3.08 goals scored per game, and 2.33 goals against per game. That's good. They're 6-4 in their last 10. They have won their last game. They've outscored the opposition 8-5 in the first, 17-11 in the second. Both scored and allowed 12 goals in the third, and there's been no overtime scoring in a game featuring the Dallas Stars to this point in the season. Utah, 6-5-3 and above the playoff line right now. So I don't know if they're going to stay there, but with 15 points, 2.93 goals scored per game, 3.38 goals against per game. They're 3-4-3 in their last 10 games. They did win last night over St. Louis, so we'll see. We'll see if they can stay there. They've scored 12 and allowed 10 in the first period. They've been outscored 18-13 in the second, outscored 16-13 in the third. They've scored and allowed 3 goals in the overtime period, so lots of overtime for Utah, and they're 500 in overtime thus far, which puts them ahead of St. Louis, who are 7-7 with 14 points. 2.64 goals scored per game, 3.14 goals against. So they need some more scoring, which won't surprise St. Louis fans hearing it. They're 5-5 in their last 10, and again, they lost last night against Utah. They've been outscored 13-6 in the first period, so that's an issue. And outscored 17-15 in the second. They've scored and allowed 14 goals in the third, and they've scored both goals in overtime when they've got there. So they finished the games pretty well. It's the start to the games that's been an issue. Colorado, somehow below the playoff line. I know people are going to say injuries and goaltending, and yeah, that'll do it. So, they're 6-8, 12 points for them. They had a good game against Winnipeg, just couldn't buy a goal. But they're still scoring at a rate of 3.29 goals per game, but they're allowing 3.93 goals against per game. Now, that factor was over 4 goals against per game not too long ago, so that is coming down. Georgiev had a good game against Winnipeg last night. They're going to need more of that from him. They're 6-4 in their last 10, and again, they lost last night. They've been outscored 20-15 in the first period. Not a very Colorado-like number. They've scored and allowed 14 goals in the second. They've been outscored 21-16 in the third. They've scored the only overtime goal in a game featuring the Avs this season. Chicago's 5-9-1, so they have 11 points. 2.53 goals scored per game, 3.2 goals against. They've been outscored in every period. 16-14 in the first, 13-10 in the second, 18-14 in the third, and they've allowed the only overtime goal in a game that they've played. They're 3-7 in their last 10. They've lost 2 in a row, but again, I think Chicago's better than they were last year. And Nashville, shockingly last, and I mean last overall, is Nashville. They're 4-9-1, 9 points, 2.36 goals scored per game. They pick up Marchessault, they pick up Stamkos, they pick up Shea, and their offense bottoms out. They're allowing 3.57 goals against per game. They're 4-5-1 in their last 10, and they've lost 3 in a row. They've been outscored in almost every period except overtime. 14-7 in the first, 17-13 in the second, 18-12 in the third. They've scored and allowed a goal in the overtime. So Nashville needs to get more fans chanting about how much the other goalie sucks in the first period, because it hasn't been happening this year. Only 7 first period goals. They're just not starting on time. It is a cliche in hockey, but it's cliche for a reason. It's really important to get that first goal and get that jump on the opposition. Vegas leads the Pacific with a record of 9-3-1 for 19 points, 4.46 goals scored per game. They're allowing an even 3 goals against per game. They're 6-3-1 in their last 10. They've won 2 in a row. And look at the scoring, and it doesn't surprise me. They've outscored the opposition 20-12 in the first. They've been outscored 17-13 in the second. They've outscored the opposition 24-9 in the third period. That's Vegas. That's how their hockey works. They just wait until the third and then turn it on. And I've spent 7 years going, all right, that's not sustainable. They can't keep it up, and then they do. In the overtime, they've scored and allowed 1 goal this year. LA is second in the division, a record of 8-4-3, 19 points, 3.27 goals scored per game, 2.93 goals against per game. And in terms of scoring by period, they've scored 11 and allowed 9 in the first period. They've scored and allowed 14 in the second. Not very LA-like numbers in the third. They've scored 24 and allowed 19. Definitely a different style than last season. And in the overtime, they've allowed both goals that have been scored there. They're 6-3-1 in their last 10, and they lost last night against Vancouver, which is a nice segue to Vancouver, who are currently 7-2-3, so they have 17 points, are above the playoff line, 3.25 goals scored per game. They're allowing 2.92 goals against per game without Demko. Thank you, Lankinen. They're 7-2-1 in their last 10. They've won 3 in a row. We'll see how things go when they come home and play against Edmonton tomorrow night. They've outscored the opposition 15-12 in the first, 11-9 in the second. They've scored and allowed 12 goals in the third. They've been outscored 2-1 in overtime. So there are still some things to be worked out by Vancouver, but they're trending in the right direction. Calgary, above the playoff line, even though they missed last season. 7-5-2 record, 16 points, 2.86 goals scored per game, 3.14 goals against. They've been outscored in first and second periods, so they're relying on the comeback a bit here. Outscored 15-8 in the first, 12-9 in the second. They've outscored the opposition 21-15 in the third. They've scored 2 and allowed 2 in the overtime. They're 3-5-2 in their last 10, and they lost in overtime last night against the Boston Bruins. So they're above the playoff line. Utah's above the playoff line. Minnesota, how much fun would it be to have them in? That means Nashville, Colorado are out, but so's Edmonton right now. They're 6-7-1 for 13 points. They're scoring 2.36 goals per game and allowing 3.21 goals per game. They're 5-4-1 in their last 10, but they've lost 2 in a row. And they're being outscored in almost every period, just not overtime. Outscored 13-7 in the first, outscored 13-12 in the second, and outscored 18-12 in the third. In the overtime, they have outscored the opposition 2-1. So Edmonton having trouble starting on time, as some other teams are, and that's something that should fix itself. When you have Draisaitl, McDavid, and all the weapons they have, that should fix itself. Seattle 5-8-1 on the season, 11 points for them, scoring 2.79 goals per game and allowing 3.21 goals against per game. They are 3-6-1 in their last 10. They've lost 4 in a row in regulation, though. They're being outscored in the first period 17-10, again starting on time. Outscored 15-13 in the second. In the third, they've outscored the opposition 15-12, and in the overtime, they've scored 1 and allowed 1. They need to stop falling behind. Anaheim 4-6-2 record, 10 points, 2.08 goals scored per game. Poor Lucas Dostal. They're allowing an even 3 goals against per game because of Lucas Dostal being excellent. They've outscored the opposition 8-7 in the first period, but they've still only scored 8 first period goals in 12 games. They've only scored 4 second period goals. They've allowed 7, and then in the third period, things open up a bit at both ends of the ice. They've scored 12, but they've allowed 20 in the third period. They've scored 1 in overtime, and they've allowed 2. They're 3-5-2 in their last 10. They've lost their last 2 games in regulation, which brings us to San Jose. And San Jose is definitely, I think, better than last year. They've won now 4 of their last 6. They got taken out by Minnesota last night, but look, Minnesota's 9-2-2. It's not a surprise. San Jose's 4-9-2 on the season for 10 points, 2.4 goals scored per game, 3.67 goals against per game. But their goals against is not the worst in the league, and neither is their goals for. There's improvement. They're 4-6 in their last 10. Again, they lost last night against Minnesota. No shame in that. They've scored 5 goals in the first period. 5. They've allowed 20. So, not great. Then they recover. 16 goals in the second, 13 allowed. In the third, not great, but definitely better than the first. 13 goals scored, 21 goals against. They've scored twice in overtime and allowed 1. So, San Jose, I think, better than last year for sure. It is a surprise to see Nashville worst overall. And there's going to be a point where we go from saying, Nashville should, or I will go from the point of saying Nashville should be able to turn this. They're too talented not to. And then say, you know what, I guess they're going to have to blow it up a little bit. So we'll see what happens, but let me know your thoughts. I think it's kind of telling, too, that the GM comes out and says for Nashville, I may have to look at a rebuild if things don't start getting better. And I would argue the team has not played better since he said it. So very often a GM will say things of that nature, trying to get things going, and it has not worked with Nashville thus far. Although playing in Washington and then playing in Florida, not easy. But still, they're 4-9-1. They've got to turn this around. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Which team do you think has overachieved so far? Which one's underachieved? And in a month's time, who's going to be above the playoff line that isn't right now? And who will they bump out? There's my challenge to you. Let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe in the event you may not have done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support, as always. I will talk to you again soon.